Hello and welcome to this first lecture for Introduction to Maya. I'm going to be showing you today a little bit of the Maya interface, how to move the camera around in 3D space. I'll show you some of the most important panels to keep your eye on, and we'll even build just simple primitives this time. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. If you're a first-time user for Maya, then this can be a little bit overwhelming to see this interface. There's quite a lot of buttons and panels and submenus and all sorts of things going on. Don't worry, we don't use all of this all the time. There are so many buttons because there are a lot of different tasks to do in Maya. Modeling, which is what we're primarily going to be learning in this lecture series, is just one of those things. And it uses a very small amount of these menus, and I'll be sure to show you all of the most important spots to look for. Okay, starting with the familiar stuff, way up in the left-hand corner, we've got File, Edit. Those are found in most Microsoft programs, Adobe programs, so that should be fairly familiar. This is where we make and open scenes and where we save scenes, so we'll be sure to do that before we end this lecture. We've got the Edit menu with our undo, redo, copy, cut, paste, delete, and a bunch of different more useful things for 3D. The only other menu we're really going to worry about today is this Create menu. This is where we're going to make our primitive shapes, but just a word of warning, there are lots of different similarly named menu items, so don't click indiscriminately. Be sure to read carefully what the name is that you're clicking on, and in Maya it's typically a bad thing to go exploring through too many of these menu sets and features before you're very familiar with it, because there's a lot of stuff that Maya can do. It's a very powerful program, and you may inadvertently cause something to happen that you don't know how to undo or resolve. Okay. One last note, I'm using Maya 2013. 2014 is currently out, probably 2015 as well. It really doesn't matter that much for the basics. The only differences between versions are fancy extra features, maybe a little bit of reprogramming as to what the old features did, but this should be general enough that you can use it for most Maya versions, maybe going back 2008 or before. Okay? Alright, so before we do any movement or building in the primary view screen here, I just want to show you where the panels are located that we're going to be using most often in this program. If you look in the upper right hand corner of the interface, we've got these three buttons up here. This one is currently depressed because that opens the channel box, which is this entire right hand side of the screen. So if we press that, channel box goes away, press that, channel box comes back. That's the one that we use most often because it will contain all of the coordinates for objects in the scene, where they're located, how large they are, what rotation they're at, etc. The next button over opens the Tool Settings panel. This is the way that you can fine-tune the way that tools behave, and also reset them with this button up at the top if they're behaving in a way that you don't expect. I don't often open this menu, but sometimes it's important for making sure that something is behaving exactly the way that you want it. And finally, we have the Attribute Editor. The Attribute Editor is more important when we get into texturing or connecting it to nodes for functionality in Maya, which we're not really going to do for a while. We will do some texturing, but the rest of that stuff we're probably not going to get to in this series. So don't worry too much about that just for now. Make sure that the channel box, though, is still visible. Typically, I like to leave that one open because I use it and refer to it so often. Okay. Now, this main screen area is our view of the 3D world in Maya. This is the grid drawn onto that screen to get our orientation. You can see down here there's the word down there, stands for perspective, which is the view that we're in, which is not locked along any of these axes. We are able to tumble it freely. So if I move this around, I'll show you how to do this in a second. I can zoom in and out. I can scoot the camera around. You can see it's fully 3D environment. Now this little compass rose down in the left-hand corner of the screen is important because that's how you get your orientation in 3D. 3D space consists of X, Y, and Z dimensions, and each one of these little lines is pointing along the positive direction for that dimension. So we've got positive X running along this direction, positive Z runs this way, and positive Y extends straight up in Maya. Typically Y is thought of as vertical in Maya, although in other programs it might be Z. Okay? So this is important because oftentimes in 3D it's a little bit tough to get your bearings and to see exactly where you are. And so this helps you to orient yourself. Oftentimes I've seen beginner modelers modeling like this, which looks perfectly fine for the objects and for the grid, but it's actually upside down. Okay, so it can get confusing, so try to make sure that you keep track of that and return to at least a right side up view, if not one that has these three extending outward like that. Okay, I'm going to use a little visual aid just because you may or may not have one of these sitting in front of you right now. When I refer to buttons, I want you guys to know which buttons I'm talking about. So this is a typical 3-button mouse. The left-hand side is typically the primary mouse button, or the left mouse button. I'll refer to it as that. The right-hand side typically is the secondary mouse button, or the right-click button. And then we've got the scroll wheel in the center. You may or may not have a 3rd-button mouse, but it is important for Maya that you have a 3-button mouse. With a scroll wheel, typically you push down and hold the scroll wheel to enact the 3rd button on the mouse. So an example using that in Maya, if I click and hold along with a hotkey, I'm able to slide the view around. Okay, so that is actually pushing down on the wheel, not scrolling it, not rolling it up and down, but actually until it clicks. If not, you may have a 3rd button that extends around it, and that would be the 3rd button, or even no scroll wheel at all. I've seen mice like that. So just be aware that those 3 types of buttons exist on the mouse. Then, of course, I've got a keyboard here. There are a few keys that are important to us in 3D. The Alt, Control, and Shift keys are particularly important for us because we use them for a lot of our quick commands, which I'm going to teach you guys how to use, and they make you tremendously effective and much, much faster at doing all sorts of operations in Maya. The space bar is important as well. We can access some menus with that. And then finally, the Q, W, E, and R keys are shortcut keys for our manipulator tools, which we use all the time in modeling. Okay, so just be aware, Q, W, E, and R, Shift, Control, Alt, and Spacebar. I like to situate my hand on this left-hand side of the keyboard, and I've seen many other modelers and Maya users do the very same thing. Typically, I'll put ring finger on W, middle E, pointer R, leaving the pinky open to grab one of these two, or possibly even the Q key, and then thumb for Alt and space. It's up to you, whatever's comfortable. It's fine if you don't rest your hands on the keyboard as well. Just know that those are typical keys that we're going to be using, okay? And where they're located on the keyboard. All right, now I'm going to show you how to manipulate the camera. Camera manipulation happens with the Alt key on the keyboard. So first thing first, just go ahead and hold down the Alt key. And then I want you to hold down the left mouse button, and you should see that you're able to rotate the view when you move the mouse in any sort of direction. So just try that a little bit. Flip it over, rotate it, and keep an eye on this space down here for your orientation so that you don't get completely tumbled out of control. Okay, so Alt and left mouse will tumble the view. Alt and right mouse, if you move your mouse either up or down or left and right, can zoom the camera. There are actually 2 ways to zoom the camera. This way is a smooth, discrete zoom. But if you let go of the Alt key and then just roll your scroll wheel, you can step in magnifications and step out magnifications as well. I don't really like this scroll wheel method because oftentimes in 3D the spaces that you have to cover are either very large or very, very small. And I just feel that holding Alt and holding the right mouse button gives me a very fine control and also allows me to go very, very large distances as well. So I just prefer that method. Okay. The third method of moving the camera, of course, is holding Alt and the middle mouse button. That allows us to pan the camera. Okay, so we're actually physically moving the camera around in the scene, over to the right, over to the left, up and down, and it's always tangent to your view. Tangent means that we are looking straight diagonally at this view, and so I'm moving up diagonally, moving down diagonally, and then moving left and right as well. So it's relative to your positioning, so if I look straight down on this grid, I'm moving directly along the z-axis now, as you can see in the little compass rows in the left-hand corner, and I'm moving directly along the x-axis now. Okay, so those are your three types of camera moves. Be sure to practice them. We'll practice them as we're building primitives later on here. But just be aware that that's how you move the camera, and moving the camera is a large part of Maya. You oftentimes have to navigate it close to the objects that you're modeling, close to the objects that you're animating, and of course you have to move the camera into a position where rendering will be most enjoyable, most beautiful. Okay? There is another hotkey I want to tell you about, F. F as in Flintstones. If you hit F, you will move the camera out to encompass every object in the scene, if there are objects in the scene. Currently we don't have any objects in the scene, so it just, frames, that's what it stands for, frames the grid. If you have an object selected later on, we can use F to move the camera directly to look at that object. So it's very useful, and we'll use that as we create some primitives here. Okay? There are multiple Viewport setups in Maya as well. Currently we're on this one right here on the left-hand lower side of this bar interface. This is the perspective view, or single perspective view. Just below it we've got a 4 view, which will split the screen into 4 quadrants, and there's a little word written at the bottom of each quadrant to tell you what view it is, and you can see the orientation of the compass rose has changed as well. So this one is the top because it is looking directly down in the negative direction in the y-axis. So that would be this direction here. Okay. This one is front because it's looking in the negative direction on z, which is just like that. Okay. And then this one is side because it's looking in the negative direction on x. We oftentimes like to use these 4 views because it's much more clean and easy to see where things line up in space. You've got these extra grids and these different dimensions to measure by. Each grid is 1 unit. Units are customizable in Maya, but just assume that it's any arbitrary measurement for now, that you might need an inch, a foot, whatever you want it to be. But this makes it very easy to line things up and snap them to get them all lined up and neat. Oftentimes we do want to move in and out of these views, and how you do that is by pressing the space bar, but if you hold the space bar you're going to see this huge menu pop up full of different options. So don't hold the space bar. In fact, if you hold the space bar and you move the mouse, wherever your mouse lands, it might select that action. So hopefully, I guess it doesn't in this case, but with our other hotkeys they will. See, these are all menus here. So you want to be careful about that. If you just tap the space bar though, rapidly, what it will do when your mouse is over a window is it will jump inside that window. Then if that window is the only one that's visible, it will reduce back to a 4 view. So you see I jumped into the front view, keep the mouse over the window, put the mouse over the top view, tap the space bar, it jumps into the top view. And it just allows us to jump in and out of views very rapidly that way. So keep that in mind. We'll try to use that as we're building things with primitives as well. Alright, now I'm going to show you how to create a primitive object and manipulate it. Up at the top row we have this Create menu. Okay, click on that and go down to Polygon Primitives. We're not going to be using NURBS primitives for now, subdiv primitives at all, volume primitives at all. I've never had any cause to use those. We primarily model in polygons. We will use NURBS a little bit later on in the course, but that's just for special purposes. Okay, Polygon primitives, and we've got this list of primitive objects: sphere, cube, cylinder, cone, plane, torus, prism, pyramid, pipe, helix, soccer ball, yes, soccer ball, and platonic solids. And then right below that we've got these two checkboxes: interactive creation and exit on completion. You might notice that I have interactive creation turned off, and that's for a reason of preference. I'm just going to turn that on and show you what interactive creation does. I just find it a little bit confusing for beginners, but if I make a cube, for example, with interactive creation on, drag the base on the grid, then pull up for height. So it wants me to make a square on the grid, and then drag again to make a cube. And this cube size is arbitrary. Okay, it's not a nice clean cube of 111 size, even though it says here in the scale that it is. Those sizes, this weird size, however many wide this is, however many deep, is actually housed down a layer inside the inputs. Here they are, 12.205, 7.649. It's just a little bit confusing and also a little bit more slow when you're just trying to make some primitives and mess around with them. So I'm going to delete that by dragging, mouse dragging around it and hitting the delete key. And I'm going to come back up to that menu, create Polygon Primitives. I'm just going to uncheck interactive creation. It will close the menu and you'll have to reopen it, create Polygon Primitives, interactive creation, and you should see it unchecked now. Okay, that's just going to be a little bit easier because now when I select a cube, it pops into the center of the grid, right at the origin point, which is 0, 0, 0, right here, and its size is 111. Okay, all 111. Very, very easy. Okay, so there's our little cube, and it looks a bit strange. It doesn't look like it's solid right now. That's because there's different ways to view polygons in the viewports, and we're going to have to use the number keys for this. Okay, so don't hit the numbers 1, 2, or 3. If you hit the numbers 1, 2, or 3, it's not going to do what you think. Okay, it's going to show us a smooth version of this, a smooth and proxy version, and an unsmooth version. That's not what we want. We want to hit number 5. Okay, number 5 is smooth shade. So it will display this object with solid walls or polygons. Okay? 4 will bring us back to the wireframe view, which, as you can see, is as if it were transparent. Okay? There are buttons for these view modes at the top of the screen, or the top of the viewport. This is the viewport. You can see wireframe here, smooth shade here. Then we've got wireframe on shaded. This will allow the wireframe to continue to exist even though we don't have the object selected. Selected, unselected. Always just a left click for selecting, by the way. Okay, so oftentimes I like to leave that on for modeling because it's very, very helpful to see the details, but it does kind of detract from the appearance of the object if you're going for something very smooth or organic. The other modes there, just don't worry about those for now. They're texturing and lighting, but we don't have any texturing, so it doesn't change anything. We don't have any lighting, so it turns completely black. So we don't want to worry about those for now. We just want to stick with 4 for wireframe and 5 for smooth shade. So this is a good time to practice your camera navigation. Remember, Alt, left, middle, and right click for various zooming effects, movement effects, and tumbling effects. So just take a little tour around the cube and look at it from all angles. Try to keep your orientation on this little compass rose. Okay, pretty easy. And if you'll remember the F key I talked about earlier, if you do not have the object selected and you hit the F key, it will actually frame it because it's the only thing in the scene. Okay, now it doesn't include the grid because this is an actual object. And if we have it selected and our camera is somewhere else, it will also go and frame it. Okay, you'll get a better idea of what it's like when it's unselected when we have multiple objects. Okay, so there we go. There's our first object. We can move around it. Okay, we can tumble, we can zoom, we can scroll, but we aren't manipulating the object yet. Okay, that's where these buttons on the left-hand side of the screen come in. This one that's highlighted, called the selection tool, is the one we've currently been using. You can left-click, you can drag. When you drag onto an object, it will become green and highlighted, and you'll see it appear in the channel box over here. You click off, it becomes blank in the channel box, and this ceases to be highlighted. Those keyboard shortcut keys that I was talking about earlier, Q, W, E, and R, are manipulator tools. Okay? Currently we're on Q, the selection tool. If you go ahead and hit W on your keyboard, it will switch to the translate tool or move tool. Okay? And if we select our object, then we see that we've got these arrows. Okay? Those arrows represent motion on those axes. Okay, so we've got the x-axis. If we click and drag the red arrow, we've got movement on the z if we click and drag the blue arrow. We've got movement on y if we click and drag the green arrow. Okay, so as you move your camera around and drag the arrows, you can see it moving in perspective. And you may find that this becomes a little bit disorienting. For instance, if you just look at where my cube is in the scene, it could either be moved back along the Z and X, or it could just be moved up along the Y and floating above this point of the grid. And you won't know until you rotate your camera and get some perspective. Okay, that's why camera motion is so important with Maya 3D and modeling, because it's the only way that you can get a complete view of the scene and an idea of where things are relative to each other. That and our views. Okay? So if you open up the 4 views just by tapping spacebar, if you'll recall, tapping spacebar, you'll see that the cube is located on the grid. Okay? And you can move this object in any one of these views. You can also move your camera. You can't rotate it though. See? No. Because these are called orthographic views. Orthographic views are locked along an axis. So I can zoom the camera, I can move the camera, and I can manipulate the object, but I can't rotate. Okay? So you can get a fairly good view of where this object is in the scene through the orthographic views. The downside is that it's just a little unrealistic. We're never really seeing a scene from an orthographic view. We're almost always seeing it from some angular, rotation here. So this is helpful as a utility, but it's not very attractive. It's not going to make for a good or realistic kind of camera angle. Okay, but it is helpful. For instance, if I wanted to place this directly on the line here, just like that, the center of these arrows is where that's located, then I would know that this object is now over the z-axis, okay, which might be important. If I wanted to try to sit this on the ground, pretending like the grid is the ground, I could move this down until the bottom green line hits the grid, the ZX plane there. And now as I move and zoom in my perspective view, I can see, oh yeah, the cube is sitting on the ground. It's actually oriented there. So that's going to make it a little bit easier to judge. Okay? So be aware of that. Let's go ahead and mess with the rest of the manipulators. If you hit the E key will allow you to rotate. So if you grab the blue ring, we're rotating in the Z direction, which is along the Z. Just imagine that this is skewered the cube, the Z axis, and that we're rotating it along that skewer. Okay. Then we've got the X direction and the Y direction. Okay. These axes kind of tumble along with the object because we're using local rotation, and that's usually Maya's default is local rotation. Don't worry about trying to keep that all straight with these axes. We're just going to do this for beauty anyway for most purposes, unless you go into animation. Then you have to worry about it a little bit more. But for now, it's just rotating it into an orientation that looks nice. Okay. You may notice that you can click and drag between these rings. That is a free rotation. Let me encourage you to only do that if you're going to place the object as if it was thrown into a scene or dropped by hand or something. This is not something we do while modeling, because it's very imprecise and it makes modeling a real pain. Okay, I'll show you how to reset all of these transformations as well to something that's a little bit more ordinary, and that'll be tremendously helpful when you model things. But for now, tumble away. It's fun. You can also move these or rotate this tangent to camera by grabbing this outer ring. There you go, rotating tangentially to camera. And just going back to the movement tool for a moment, if you grab within this small yellow square, you can also move on all three axes tangent to camera. Another thing that we often don't do in modeling because it's imprecise. Okay? So that was Q for selection, W for translation, E for rotation, and R for scaling. If you grab one of these boxes, the object will become longer or shorter in that dimension. Longer or shorter. Longer or shorter. And then in this case, for the scale tool, we do often use the central cube. That's to make the object overall bigger, overall smaller on all three axes in the scene. Okay? Great. So we should have a box which has been moved into some other location on the grid, a box which has been rotated into some other position other than on axis, and a box which has been scaled into some sort of rectangular box. Okay? If you have those three things done and take a look in the channel box, you're going to see we have translate XYZ, rotate XYZ, and scale XYZ. These are the dimensions that we have altered to make this box placed where it is, rotated how it is, and scaled how it is. Okay? Let's reset this box to how it was instantiated on the grid by entering in 3 zeros for translate X, Y, and Z. You can just click in the box, type a 0, and hit enter. Click in the box, type a 0, hit enter. Click in the box, type a 0, hit enter. Or for rotate X, rotate Y, rotate Z, we're going to put zeros, but we're going to do this all at once. Click and drag down from the first number to the last number, type a 0, hit enter, and all three of those will return to 0. Okay, a little bit faster way of doing it. And the scales are not 0, they are going to all be 1. So click and drag from the top number down to the bottom number. Oops, I had it selected. There we go. Once you have it selected like this, it won't allow you to click and drag again. You have to deselect by clicking somewhere else and then reselect it again. Okay? Do it all in one click. So click and drag, not click, then click and drag. That won't work. Okay? So now this cube is returned to the origin, which is 0, 0, 0 on the grid. It's rotated evenly with the rest of the environment, and it's scaled back to 1, 1, 1. So it's all very nice and orderly. Okay? Very briefly, let's take a look at some of the other primitives. I'm just going to delete that one. Create polygon primitives. We've got a sphere, exactly as you would imagine it. Okay. We've got cylinder, round in one dimension, flat in the other dimension. Cone. Plane. Okay, just two-dimensional in that case. Torus, otherwise known as donut. And there are ways to customize the appearance of each one of these primitives. I just want you to create one of each and mess around with them. Just get to know them. Polygon primitive prism. Polygon primitive pyramid. Pipe, like a cylinder but with another cylinder inside of it, closed off, very helpful. Polygon primitive Helix. This one is fun. I will actually mess with this one a little bit just to show you that we can alter things about it, how many twists there are, how high it is. We'll get into all these inputs later on, but now that you see me doing it, you can mess around with it if you'd like. Okay. So a spring or helix. Create polygon primitive soccer ball. No kidding, soccer ball. It's special because it has one of these pentagons and hexagons making up the entire surface of it. Something that would be very difficult to create on your own. Polygon primitive platonic solid has one type of polygon for each side. So these are all pentagons, and it has a number of different settings for it. Okay? So what I'd like to do, just to round this out, and before you guys have your homework is going to be to make a scene of primitive objects. Okay? We will have another lecture about all of the ways to customize those primitives, but just to show you the idea, I'm going to make a very simple little house. So I'm going to create a polygon primitive cube. Okay? I'm going to move this up onto the grid. I can either eyeball it by looking at where the grid intersects here, or I could pop into one of these orthographic views like this front view, and since I can see Y extending upward, I know that that is vertical, and I could put the edge on the grid there. Okay? Or another way, I could use math. Okay? When I return it to normal, 0, it's sitting in the middle of the grid, and I know that this cube is 1, 1, 1, and so if I want to move it up to where it perfectly sits on the grid, I divide 1 by 2. 0.5. And it's right on the grid. Okay? Sometimes when you're doing things which are very mechanical, very, very precise, you want to definitely use these numbers to your advantage. For now, since I'm just kind of playing around with them, just kind of building blocks, I'm going to do it by eye because it doesn't really matter. Okay? So I'm going to make a little house. There's the base of my house. Polygon primitive, let's see, what do I want? A prism, I believe. Yeah, a prism. Okay, that's going to make the roof of my house. It needs to be tipped over 90 degrees. Okay, if you might remember math class, a full circle has 360 degrees. So half a circle is 180 degrees, and a quarter of a circle is 90 degrees. I'll promise you that's about as much math as we'll do. Okay. So I'm going to place it until you can see them kind of intersecting into each other. That's perfectly fine, by the way, for building things out of primitives or even out of more complex modeled things. We just want to make sure we have control of it and we decide where they intersect. I'm going to place it so that they just barely don't intersect right there at the top. And then I'm going to use my scale tool to make this skinny right down to a little bit larger than the cube and a little bit larger than the cube. Kind of a Monopoly house. I think my house is a little tall though. So I'm going to squish this down a bit and move it back to right where it touches the grid. And I'll do the same thing here. Squish this down a bit. There we go. That looks more like a Monopoly house. Okay? Just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a little chimney so it looks like an actual house. Create polygon primitive cube. Now this cube needs to be much, much smaller. I'm going to just shrink it in all 3 axes and move it out of the house there. And you can see that I can just line this up along the side of the house and then make it longer. Let's see, right about there, and I could put another cube down here for the wide part of the fireplace. So sticking out of the side of the house like that, and what the heck, I'll put it over in one corner like that. Create another polygon primitive. Actually, this time, instead of creating a polygon primitive cube, I'm going to duplicate this one so that I have a starter which is very, very similar and in the same position as this one, because I just want a wider base down at the bottom here. So I'm going to select this chimney bit. Okay. I'm going to go up to Edit, Duplicate. You can see the shortcut is listed there on the right hand side of the command, Control D. So you could always hit Control D if you want. What you don't want to do is cut, copy, paste. Those are for values. They're never for things in the 3D view here. So duplicate, and you can kind of see the outline changed a little bit. That's because as long as I've still got this selected, that is as long as I don't click somewhere else, I've got the duplicate selected. There it is, and it can intersect right with the original one. So I'm going to just move this down a little bit. Okay, I'm going to shrink it in this direction and expand it in this direction. So I just want to try to play with it until I can get it to touch the ground and touch the bottom of my existing chimney bit. So you can see it's a little bit too wide. This is where the wireframe view might come in handy. Okay, so I can see it's intersecting a little bit there. Let me shrink it, return it back to smooth shade, and we're just about doing it right there. So there you go. You can see it's perfectly centered because I used a duplicate and scaled it uniformly from the center and then from these dimensions here. So we've got a nice little house there. Now this might seem like it's a little bit juvenile, but this is really how modeling works at its base. We just take different primitive shapes as a start, and then we do things to them that makes them look a little bit more detailed, a little bit more realistic. For instance, if I wanted to further improve this chimney, I could duplicate this again, make it slightly larger and much shorter, and place it on the top there, and it's got kind of like an extra bit of brickwork now in that dimension. Or if we were really trying to make a more realistic house, I could make another cube and I could put doors and windows on it, or at least what look like doors and windows in a very play school kind of way. So I've got a very thin wafer little door here, and I push it back into the house until it intersects, and it's sticking through the bottom just a little bit. But now we've got that little edge there that kind of says, oh, there's something going on there. We could add windows, you know. Eventually, when you get around to modeling realistic things, you would put, you know, wooden or aluminum siding on the side of the walls. You would put doorknobs. You would put eaves. You would put tiles, shingle tiles on the top of the house. All the things that a real house has, but they all start out this way. They start out as primitives that we then enhance and mold into the shapes that we need. Okay? I hope that that was helpful. Go ahead and do some practice building simplified things like this, or build this very house. Be sure to practice your camera movement. Be sure to practice moving, manipulating objects, and use your various views using the space bar to get a better view of the thing that you're doing so that you can keep it in perspective and know that everything is lined up nicely.